Hi, folks. I've been documenting my journey of ministering to a transsexual Christian by the name of Chris. Now, I first met Chris in the 1970s and performed his wedding to Mary in the late, the latter half of the 1970s. And then they went on to live their lives, and eventually I lost touch with him. I knew a little bit about his journey and the course that he had taken. And then back in about 2018, I had frequent contact with his wife. And back in 2018, that she told me a little bit about what was going on with Chris, and I asked her at that time if he would be open to me reaching out and contacting him. And she said, well, you sure, give it a try. And so that's what I've done. And ever since 2018, I've been ministering to Chris on a regular basis. And if you want a little bit more of the backstory of our times together, you can watch our previous episodes. This is episode 6 in our my journal on this. And in this episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about how philosophy shapes the gender debate. So let's go ahead and we will just start taking a look at that. That when it comes to the gender debate, is that we need to get our facts straight. And one fact that we need to remember is that biological reality is a fact. Now, I know a lot of folks have been kind of talked out of that, but that doesn't change. Biological reality is a fact, and people are born either male or female. Now, in a previous episode, I had talked about the whole intersex question, and so you can watch that episode. I don't recall what number it is, but people are born male or female. And that I believe that our biology shapes our destiny. And we need to be clear that sex is not assigned at birth. One of the things that I find particularly troubling about this and so many other issues is how language shapes the discussion. And there's just subtle changes in language that we end up just kind of adopting that really leads us into, I think, erroneous thinking on this. Sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is discovered at birth, but it's not assigned at birth. And so people are born either male or female. And that, so the vast majority of people, and I want to give us a little bit of a backstory. I want to kind of set the table before we get into the philosophical issues. And the backstory is that I believe that the vast majority of people in the world all want the same thing, and that's an abundant life. And we just disagree on the journeys on how to get there. And our journey is always as an embodied self. And so some folks take a particular journey while others go another route, and we're going to explore what these routes look like in just a moment. But we all travel our own journey. That doesn't mean that our own journey, that a person's journey, and certainly while it may be unique to that individual, that doesn't mean that the journey that that individual is traveling on is one that really reflects larger truths, and we will kind of explore that as we go along. Now, the traditional male journey looks something like this. A baby is born a boy and then eventually becomes a man. That man oftentimes will become a husband and then a father, and if they live long enough, if they're blessed to live long enough, then they will become a grandfather. Now, the essential male journey, now I realize that it can be cut short by a premature death, but the essential male journey is that an infant is born a boy and becomes a man. And how that journey goes on from there, because not every man has to get married, not every man has to become a father, and so on. And so, but certainly the boy-man component is part of the essential male journey. Now, let me just share with you briefly about my story. Is that I was born a boy, I became a man, a husband, a father of 3 wonderful kids, and a grandfather of some grandchildren who are the delight of my life. But the only thing that connected me to the abundant life was not becoming a husband or a father or a grandfather, as significant as those kind of milestones in my life are. But the thing that really connected me to the abundant life is back at age 17, I made my commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ. And as a result, as I've gone through the various stages of living out my male journey, that's the thing, the one and only thing that has connected me to the abundant life. Jesus himself says in John 10:10, he says, I've came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. And I believe that that's true. You know, we can go on whatever journey, male or female, that we are on, and we think that maybe getting married is going to complete us, or becoming a parent is going to complete us, or certain aspects of our career are going to complete us. But the only thing, I believe that the only thing that truly completes us, that helps us to discover our new destiny, is beginning to walk with Christ and walk with him all along the way. And so that's kind of what happened with me, and I'm grateful that that happened at age 17. I'll share my personal testimony some other time, but not today. And Chris actually took a very similar journey to mine in the first half of his life. Is that he was born a boy, became a man, then a husband, a father of 4 children, and he also committed his life to Christ at age 17. But after becoming a father of 4 children, is that he took a detour and began to really become obsessed with the whole gender identity question. Now, I would like to explore how that happened in Chris's life, and I will do that in an upcoming broadcast. But in the meantime, once Chris decided to go down this path of gender identity, believing that he was a woman or is a woman, is that then he began to travel that path, and it destroyed his marriage and alienated him from his kids and also his family of origin. And so he traveled the whole path from social transition. I think that he socially transitioned in the 90s, that and then medically transitioned, started to take hormone replacement therapy sometime after that, and then eventually went to Thailand. He was a kind of an early adopter on some of these gender reassignment surgeries, and so he went to Thailand to surgically transition. There's one thing that I just think is so important for us to gain clarity on, and I like what Mike Winger says. Mike is a Christian pastor and also apologist, and he says this, is that nobody has ever transitioned from male to female, no one ever. Now, I have a previous broadcast where I did a number of queries of AI, asking if a male can become female, and it just does not happen. It doesn't happen even if you socially transition. It doesn't happen if you medically transition. It doesn't happen that if you surgically transition. You can, as a man, you can change how the perception of others, how they see you, but you do not change either your chromosomes or your gametes, how your body is structured and planned for reproduction. Now, it doesn't matter if your body functions properly like that. It's really the body plan. So, in other words, is an infertile man a man? Yes, that's the answer to that. That was one of the interesting questions that I explored with Chris, that when he was having a health issue, that it dawned on me that it might be related to his prostate. And so we had a conversation about him talking with his doctor about having his PSA levels checked to make sure that there wasn't something else going on. And we're happy to report that that wasn't prostate cancer. By the way, is that Chris has given me full permission to share all aspects of his story, with the exception of his name. And we have our reasons for that, but he felt that it was important for him to remain anonymous at this point in his life. And so I have honored that. We initially were going to go down the path of him telling his story, but that all kind of changed. And I will just leave it at that for now. So that when we're thinking about people transitioning, like Mike Winger says, is that nobody has ever transitioned. And that's one of the things that I think is a little bit misleading when we talk about males and men transitioning transitioning from a man to a woman. It doesn't happen. A person becomes a surgically altered male or a medically altered male, but it doesn't matter how many organs you cut off or how many implants you get, is that those things don't turn you into a female. It just changes how you appear to others. So Chris's journey has been pretty clear, and we've talked about that, how that he went down this path as far as you could go with pursuing his gender identity, social transition, medical transition, and his surgical transition. But he'll tell you himself that the one thing that brought him back to the place where he has experienced an abundant life was recommitting his life to Christ. That he has done that actually just a little bit before I began meeting with him. I think it was about 2016. So, and Chris loves the Lord Jesus, is that he wants to honor and glorify him in his life, and he has sought many times. We've had many conversations about how kind of the legacy that he can leave with respect to how he can glorify God in his body, given the realities of his medical challenges. And there's been a number of those. When we are considering the backdrop to how philosophy shapes the gender debate, there are three factors that I see at work in our culture, particularly with respect to men. And it's one of the advantages of getting older, is that it gives you at least some perspective if you can remember what that perspective is. but we see in our culture the messaging that dads are expendable. Now, I've been a pastor for a long time, coming up on 50 years, and I'm telling you right now that one of the biggest problems that people oftentimes face when it comes to settling into a growth path and a well-adjusted adult life, and one of the biggest obstacles to that is their relationship with their dads. And too often we see that dads are absent from the home, are neglectful of the children, or are abusive in that relationship. And that becomes a major stumbling block for many people. But not only do we see this issue of dads being expendable, that our culture sends us this message, but also that marriage is revisable. And this, of course, has taken place in our culture over the last few decades, where not only we went from heterosexual natural marriage to same-sex marriage, and that now has been ushered into law throughout many Western cultures. But then also, I can remember back in the day with respect to divorce. When I was going to school, grade school, and even high school, is that when I was going to school, it was just very, very, very rare to meet a kid who came from a divorced family. Now it seems that it's very, very, very rare to meet a kid who doesn't come from a divorced family. And so various aspects of marriage have been under assault as well. Then we have this whole issue of gender. And now we are living through this season that gender is said to be malleable, and that men can become women and women become men, and so on. And so this is a message that is, this drumbeat, we're constantly hearing this, actually, in the media, in part of the political debate, as well as within the medical establishment. And so this affects not only men, but also women. And so as a result, some folks decide to, as a result of their own, an expression of their own gender identity, some adults choose this path. And now we have begun to see how the role of the parents oftentimes is undermined by either the medical or the political establishment, and that even children are being treated for, and I almost hate to use the word treated, because it kind of gives us the impression that this is a positive thing. It's kind of like an antibiotic. It's a positive thing to apply to a particular medical condition. But and oftentimes the impetus for that is that, well, would you rather have an alive daughter than a dead son? And so minors at a greater and greater frequency are traveling down this path. I think we need to kind of pump the brakes a little bit on this and think this through more clearly. But one of the big problems here, again, as we think about the backdrop of all of this, is the irreversibility of transitioning. Now, when I first reconnected with Chris, that we were exploring the whole possibility of him detransitioning, and we had a lot of discussions about what that would entail and how that would look. But the fact of the matter is that once you've gone a certain length down the transition pathway, is that there are certain options that no longer are possible for you. I mean, that if you detransition after surgically transitioning, the door to becoming a father naturally is closed. If you detransition, excuse me, after medically transitioning, that the door to becoming a father may be closed, because sometimes these medical treatments do cause sterility, and so on. Certainly for women who have gone through some of these treatments, is that it may cause sterility for them too as well. And then if you seek to detransition after socially transitioning, you may be able to travel down the path of becoming a husband, father, or grandfather. It might happen. I just don't know. But what I want to do now is pivot, and let's talk a little bit about, because we spent some time laying the backdrop for all of this. Let's talk a little bit about the philosophy behind gender ideology. And what it is that it's a 3-ingredient cocktail. There may be more to it than just this, but there are 3 main factors that play a part, 3 main philosophical factors that play a part in the philosophy behind gender ideology. Now, one of those ingredients is this. It's that it's the claim that gender isn't, so gender is a social construct. You'll hear that a lot. And so that gender isn't a fixed essence given at birth. Individuals actively, there we go, choose or create who they are. And the shorthand way of talking about this philosophically is that existence precedes essence. So what that means is that you first come into existence, and then you make choices of who you will become. And this philosophy is known as existentialism, popularized by Jean-Paul Sartre. Another ingredient in this cocktail is that biological reality isn't an absolute truth. You can find your truth about your gender identity, and so it's the whole idea that we can find our own personal truth, and that so absolute truths. One of the things you should always, whenever anybody says something like there are no absolute truths, the first question you should ask, is that absolutely true? People like to parrot a lot of these things that they've heard, teachers or people in authority to say, but they don't think through these matters themselves. Everybody is making an absolute truth claim when it comes to this whole question about gender, is that either biological reality is primary, or a person's feelings about their gender identity is primary, but those two ideas are mutually exclusive, and one or the other is going to be fundamental to this whole debate. So that there are no absolute truths, and of course we know that is false on its face. And this is rooted in the idea of postmodernism. But then we also have the third ingredient in this cocktail, which is trans people are an oppressed class. So rather than thinking in terms of good and bad, rather than thinking in terms of true and false, that this philosophy thinks in terms of oppressed and oppressors. And so the majority is oppressing the minority, and the idea is that society needs to change in order to correct this injustice. And we see this at work in so many places throughout our culture, and this is the philosophy of critical theory. Now, critical theory, I think another fair name for critical theory is cultural Marxism, where Marx based his whole thesis on economics, that critical theory, that some thinkers in Italy and elsewhere came along and repurposed Marxism with respect to these to various social systems, and changed it up where we have the majority who's the oppressor, so we need to overthrow the oppressors for social justice and equity on the part of the oppressed. Excuse me. So these three ingredients that we're talking about here, existentialism, postmodernism, and also critical theory, are some of the main ingredients that are behind this the philosophy that shapes the gender debate. Why is that important? Well, let's go ahead and consider that question, because here's the way it works in reality, is that philosophy shapes policies and practices. So whenever a philosophy works its way through a culture, that philosophy is going to shape policies and practices. And that's also true with this whole gender identity question. And it's going to shape philosophy, is going to shape medicine and health. It's going to shape law and politics, and it's going to shape our social interaction. And we've seen this on a large scale, writ large, in our society today, with how philosophy has shaped these various dimensions of our understanding this issue. So let's consider the core claim of gender, this philosophy of gender ideology. And the core claim is just simply this, that a person's gender identity is more fundamental than that person's biological sex. And that, and also as a result of that, is that we see people that their gender identity is more fundamental, and so therefore it's gender that's the big question. And then we ask, well, how many genders are there? And we are told constantly by not just individuals, but the people who hold the reins of power in institutions, that, well, gender is a spectrum. Facebook is an example. When you ask them how many, well, back in 2014, Facebook identified 58 genders, but now it's more quote unquote inclusive. And so whatever gender you'd like to be, I guess that now that's recognized as a legitimate gender on Facebook. That when it comes to identifying these genders, I started going down the rabbit hole trying to find out how many, what's the list of genders. And one website that I went to has nearly 200 different genders listed, cataloged there on the website according to alphabetical order. And some of this is just a small sampling of some of these, is that we have the atomist gender, and that's a gender that is indefinable or indomitable. We have the alexi gender, and that's a fluid gender identity between more than one type of gender, although they cannot name the genders that they feel fluid in. That's kind of curious. But then we have biogender, and it's not what you think it is that biogender is someone whose gender is closely related to nature, and not their nature of being themselves as a person, but we're talking about the natural realms. That person identifies most closely with nature itself. Then we have boy flux is another example, and that person identifies themselves as male, but they experience varying degrees of male identity. Over here in the C category, we have kale gender, and no, it's not what you think it is. Kale gender, oddly enough, is an individual who shares the qualities or aesthetics of outer space. And then we have Cavus gender, and that individual feels close to one gender when depressed and to another when not depressed. And you can begin to see where this is leading, is that it's just kind of like a duck soup of all sorts of kind of ideas of what my gender truly is. And then, of course, here in recently, we have been confronted with the heartbreaking reality of how this has played out in our culture with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and also the attack on the ICE facilities, is that by, in this case, two separate individuals who identify as a furry. Now, a furry is a xenogender that has multiple definitions. What that means is that it's a gender that can only be described as one's fursona, I guess what animal you identify as, or a gender identity that's related to or enthusiasm for anthropomorphic mammals, or finally, a person dedicates their life into being a furry, considering themselves as an animal and wanting to incorporate that into their identity. Now, that and you thought it was complicated with men thinking that they're women. Now we've opened up this Pandora's box to a spectrum of genders. And where this leads is, if you just think this through, that where this leads is, at least I believe, a pretty troubling place, is because now the affirmation burden grows. So the individual asserts a particular identity, and now it's incumbent upon the rest of society to recognize that identity, no matter what. And it also completely blurs the lines between rational thinking and mental illness, because to say anybody who thinks of themselves in this way is mentally ill, well, then that's not tolerant, or that's not inclusive. And so we moralize that even exploring the possibility of a person's mental illness, we've kind of wiped that completely, or taken that completely off the table. Your job, and you only have one job as the rest of society, is affirmation of that person's alleged gender. I just don't see how a society can remain healthy if this is the posture that it takes with respect to gender identity. I looked it up, with respect to the World Health Organization, why is that important? Is because the World Health Organization serves as a central authority in developing global health care guidelines, and it's the policy of the World Health Organization to say that gender is a spectrum, although they refrain from saying how many different genders that there are. But understand this for a moment, folks, is that this organization is setting policy and practices for the rest of the world. And what they're saying is that you have to think this way about gender, and the only approved way to think about gender is by asserting that gender is a spectrum. And we've seen when it comes to how many different types of genders that opens the door to. So with respect to the World Health Authority, is that I had the naive impression that we have a bunch of high-level professionals in lab coats doing research on trying to determine these types of important issues. But then I looked up one of the key task forces that they have in developing policies with respect to gender. And on that task force serves Erica Castellanos, who is a trans woman living with HIV from Belize, who actually is a former sex worker, and she resides now in the Netherlands, and she is one of the contributors to the World Health Organization's guidelines on the health of trans and gender diverse people. She's also the executive director of GATE, which is the Global Action for Trans Equality. Well, I thought certainly that has to be an anomaly, that the folks that are developing these policies, that this is the exception rather than the rule. And because, how could an individual who's already committed to a particular lifestyle be unbiased on this? And so I looked it up, and that when we begin to look at the individuals who are serving on this task force, is that we have one individual who is a trans and feminist activist, another one who is the program officer at Transat, a trans-led, trans-specific group, another one who has a long history of LGBTI trans activism, another one who is the co-founder of the Thai Transgender Alliance, a founding director and CEO of the Association for Transgender Health in India, one individual who is self-described as a queer man of trans experience, another individual who describes himself as an empowered transgendered woman working in advocacy, another one who has a long-term involvement in trans and queer feminist organizing, and another one who is the executive director of Trans Network Uganda, and so on and so forth. Here's the point that I would like to raise, is that wouldn't it be fair to explore the question of bias when it's very apparent that many of the people who are shaping the policies for how the rest of the world thinks about these matters are people who have a particular ideological bent or lifestyle approach? I want to wrap this up with a tale of two persons. And the first individual that I'd like to share their story is an individual by the name of Lily Elba. Now, Lily Elba, as far as we know, is one of the earliest recipients of gender-affirming surgery in 1930. Is when she transitioned into a woman. a man who transitioned into a woman, or at least had these surgeries, a series of surgeries along these lines, is that she was born Einar Wegener and was a Danish artist, and married, when she was living as a male, or living as a male, that she married Gerda Gottlieb. That marriage was annulled when she was going further down this path of this transitioning. She changed her name legally. She sought to marry a man, and she died. She wanted to carry that man's children, but she died following a uterus transplant in 1931. A book was written about her in 1931, that Man into Woman, an authentic record of change of sex. And once again, the title betrays the philosophy behind it, because Lily Alba, although she was a man who underwent a series of treatments and surgeries, she never turned into a woman or changed her sex. She changed how she presented in public, but she never changed her sex. So these are important questions that impact real people's lives. There's another individual I'd like for us just to consider for a moment, and that's Rosemary Kennedy. Some of you know the story of Rosemary Kennedy, that she was the daughter of Joe Kennedy Sr., the sister of John F. Kennedy, and also Robert Kennedy. She was lobotomized in 1941 at the age of 23. And the reason for that is that the family thought that this was the best way to treat her mental illness, because she exhibited irritability and mood swings and violent behavior, and they were also concerned about the threat of an unwanted pregnancy and how that would tarnish the family name. So her father ordered the procedure, but the surgery was botched, and she was institutionalized for about 60 years as a result. Her mother, on one occasion, when she met with her daughter years later on a family visit, she said to her daughter, "Oh, Rosie, what did we do to you?" That medicine and media of the day touted lobotomies as being a miracle cure. And I'm wondering how many parents who have been influenced by medicine and media today are going to look back on that decision that they've made for their children with respect to this transitioning matter, are going to have some profound regrets. For thousands who underwent lobotomy, the truth about this medical procedure that was touted to the public, the truth was revealed too late. And I hope and pray that we will gain clarity with respect to this matter of sexual transition, with respect to gender identity and its implications for the lives of so many people. You know, I've spent a lot of time here in this particular broadcast looking at the philosophy behind the gender debate. Next time around, I'd like to present an alternative approach for our consideration. So that's it for now. I hope to